If your grandmother threw away the vegetable water, scrubbed her cast iron with soap every single time, or refused to let meat sit out before cooking, then she was doing it wrong according to the women who actually fed entire families on almost nothing and produced food that people still talk about decades later. These were black grandmothers in the American South during the 1960s, and they had cooking methods that doctors told them to stop. Nutritionists called dangerous, and food safety boards actively campaigned against. Here is the wild part. Modern science, food researchers, and even Michelin-starred chefs are now quietly admitting that these women were operating on a level nobody understood at the time. We are counting down all 25 of these so-called forbidden techniques, and by the end of this video, your relationship with food will never be the same. Number 25. Washing meat with vinegar and lemon before cooking. Walk into any Southern black grandmother's kitchen in 1963 and she was washing her chicken, her pork, her fish, everything, with a mixture of cold water, white vinegar, and fresh lemon juice. Health officials in the 1960s and even the USDA pushed hard against this practice. They said rinsing raw meat spread bacteria around the sink. They said it was unnecessary and even counterproductive. But here's what the grandmothers knew that the officials didn't understand yet. The acidic environment created by vinegar and lemon doesn't just rinse the surface. It actively reduces surface bacterial load, breaks down residual slaughterhouse compounds, and begins a mild chemical tenderizing process that improves texture. Modern food science confirms that diluted acid solutions do meaningfully reduce certain pathogens on meat surfaces. The key is what you do after: immediate pat drying, no splashing, direct to the seasoning bowl. Grandma had the full protocol down perfectly. They weren't being unsanitary. They were being precise. Number 24. Soaking dried beans in salt water overnight instead of plain water. In church cookbooks and nutrition guides distributed through black community centers in the 1960s, the official advice was always soak your beans in plain water and add salt only during or after cooking. Adding salt to the soak water was called a mistake that made beans tough. Big Mama ignored that completely. She soaked her pintos, her black-eyed peas, her butter beans in salted water overnight, and her beans came out with perfectly intact skins, creamy centers, and a depth of seasoning that started from the inside. Food science now explains this beautifully. A saltwater brine during soaking causes sodium ions to replace some of the calcium and magnesium in the bean's cell wall, actually weakening that wall in a controlled way that leads to creamier texture without blowouts. The beans absorb flavor from the beginning rather than only from the outside in. Grandma was brining her beans before brining was a culinary trend. Number 23. Keeping a cast iron skillet that never got washed with soap. This one was genuinely controversial. In the mid-1960s, with the rise of antibacterial soaps and modern sanitation campaigns targeting black neighborhoods specifically, often framed as uplift and hygiene education, health workers and home extension agents literally went door to door telling grandmothers they needed to wash their cast iron with dish soap. Big Mama's cast iron got rinsed with hot water, wiped, and oiled. That was it. The layer of polymerized fat built up on that skillet over years was treated like a biohazard by these agents. Modern science calls it seasoning, one of the most effective natural nonstick surfaces ever developed, one that also adds trace dietary iron to food, which was critically important for black families who face nutritional deficiencies linked to poverty and food access inequality. That skillet was a health tool, not a sanitation problem. Number 22. Using pot liquor as a medicine and a cooking base. Pot liquor, the liquid left behind after cooking greens, was considered waste by mainstream 1960s nutritional thinking. Throw it out, they said. You've already eaten the good part. In black households, Nana saved every drop. She fed it to sick children, stirred it into cornbread batter, used it as a soup base. She was called superstitious and old-fashioned. But pot liquor is now understood to be extraordinarily nutrient-dense. When you cook collard greens, mustard greens, or turnip greens, water-soluble vitamins including folate, vitamin K, and vitamin C, along with minerals like iron and calcium, leach directly into that liquid. For black families dealing with limited grocery access and nutritional gaps, Pot liquor was literally liquid nutrition. Grandma wasn't being superstitious. She was maximizing every single resource because she had learned from generations before her that nothing goes to waste. Number 21. Seasoning cast iron with lard instead of vegetable oil. When Crisco and vegetable shortening began their aggressive marketing campaigns in the 1960s, targeting black communities specifically with advertisements in Ebony magazine and church pamphlets, they pushed the idea that animal fat was old-fashioned and unhealthy. Grandmothers who continued using lard to season and cook in their cast iron were seen as behind the times. But lard, particularly from pasture-raised animals, has a smoke point and fat composition that actually creates a more stable, better polymerized seasoning layer in cast iron than many vegetable oils. Modern culinary science has brought lard back with full scientific endorsement. The monounsaturated fat content in lard makes it more resistant to oxidation than many seed oils. Grandma's skillet seasoned with lard was superior technology, not a health risk. Number 20. Adding a splash of apple cider vinegar to greens while cooking. Health officials in the 1960s said adding vinegar to cooking vegetables destroyed nutrients. Grandmothers across the Black South added a splash of apple cider vinegar to their greens pot without apology. The reason wasn't just flavor, though the brightness it adds to long-cooked greens is remarkable. The acid in the vinegar helps break down the oxalic acid in greens like collards and spinach, which actually improves the bioavailability of calcium and iron in those vegetables. Acid also helps greens retain their vibrant color through the cooking process. Additionally, apple cider vinegar contains acetic acid compounds that improve digestive function. Grandma's greens were more nutritious than the plain-boiled version the nutritionists were recommending. The science now agrees completely. Number 19. Letting buttermilk biscuit dough rest without overworking it. In the 1960s, cooking classes taught in schools and community programs that black women often had limited access to or were offered inferior versions of, emphasized kneading biscuit dough thoroughly. Grandmothers who barely touched their dough, who used cold lard or butter, who folded just enough to bring the dough together and then walked away were told they were doing it wrong. Food science explains gluten development. Overworking biscuit dough develops gluten strands that make biscuits tough and dense. Minimal handling keeps gluten development low, creating tender, flaky, sky-high layers. Cold fat creates steam pockets during baking that produce those layers. Big Mama's gentle hands weren't laziness or ignorance. They were precision baking technique validated by every pastry chef and food scientist working today. Number 18. Cooking low and slow with the lid on for everything. In the 1960s, the pressure cooker was being heavily marketed to black households as the modern, efficient alternative to slow cooking. Cooking associations and appliance companies promoted pressure cooking as superior. Grandmothers who kept their lids on and their flames low were called slow and inefficient. But low and slow lid-on cooking does something pressure cooking cannot replicate for flavor. The Maillard reaction products, the collagen breakdown, the emulsification of fat and liquid, the development of complex sugars, all of these happen at a rate and depth in low-slow covered cooking that produces fundamentally different and more complex flavors. Modern culinary science and the entire professional slow cooker and braising tradition now validates exactly what Granny was doing every Sunday morning starting at 6 a.m. Number 17. Using fatback or smoked neck bones to season vegetables. This practice was under direct assault in the 1960s. As cardiovascular disease awareness grew and public health campaigns began, campaigns that often targeted black communities with blunt messaging about fat consumption, grandmothers who put fatback into their string beans or neck bones into their black-eyed peas were warned they were poisoning their families. But the role of those smoked bones and pork fat went beyond flavor alone. The collagen in smoked neck bones breaks down into gelatin during cooking, which creates body and richness in the pot liquor and helps the body absorb fat-soluble nutrients from the vegetables being cooked alongside it. The smoke compounds from properly smoked pork also have mild antimicrobial properties. This was a sophisticated flavor and nutrition system that the blunt fat is bad messaging of the 1960s completely failed to appreciate. Number 16. making a roux from scratch by cooking flour and fat until dark. A dark roux was considered a burnt mistake by many mainstream cooking instructors of the 1960s. You were supposed to cook flour and fat together briefly for a pale blonde roux. Black grandmothers making gumbo, etouffee, and gravies cooked their roux until it was the color of dark chocolate, sometimes for 45 minutes or more of constant stirring. This was called overcooking and even burning by critics, but a dark roux undergoes the Maillard reaction extensively, creating hundreds of new flavor compounds that simply do not exist in a pale roux. The nutty, complex, almost coffee-like depth of a properly darkened roux is now understood to be one of the most sophisticated flavor-building techniques in all of culinary science. Those 45 minutes of stirring were not a mistake. They were mastery. Number 15. Rubbing dry salt directly onto meat and letting it sit uncovered in the refrigerator. In the 1960s, leaving uncovered meat in the refrigerator was considered unsanitary and was actively discouraged. Grandmothers who salted their roasts, their turkeys, their whole chickens and left them uncovered in the icebox for 24 hours or more were thought to be creating food safety hazards. This technique is now called dry brining, and it is the gold standard recommended by professional chefs and food scientists worldwide. The salt draws moisture to the surface through osmosis, then that moisture dissolves the salt and gets reabsorbed back into the meat, seasoning it deeply from within. Leaving it uncovered allows the surface to dry out, which creates a dramatically better sear and crust when the meat hits heat. Grandma's refrigerator technique was dry brining before the culinary world had a name for it. Number 14. Adding sugar to cornbread batter. This is one of the most contested debates in Black Southern food culture, and it traces back further than most people realize. In the 1960s, purist voices, including some within the Black community, insisted that real Southern cornbread had no sugar. Church groups had debates about it, but many Black grandmothers, particularly those whose families had roots in certain regions or whose cornbread accompanied specific dishes, added a small amount of sugar to their batter. The science is interesting here. A small amount of sugar in cornbread batter does several things. It promotes better browning through caramelization, it helps retain moisture during baking, and it creates a more balanced flavor profile that allows the corn flavor to come forward rather than being overwhelmed by the savory and bitter notes of the flour and leavening. Grandma wasn't making cake, she was balancing flavor chemistry. Number 13. Never measuring spices, seasoning entirely by smell and feel. This practice was considered unscientific and unreliable by the home economics movement of the 1960s, which pushed standardized measurements and reproducible recipes as the pinnacle of modern cooking. Black grandmothers who taught by showing a palmful of this, a handful of that, cook it till it smells right, were seen as unable to produce consistent results. But emerging neuroscience and culinary psychology now understand that experienced cooks who season by sensory feedback are actually engaging a sophisticated internal calibration system built through thousands of hours of exposure. The olfactory system can detect flavor compound concentrations with extraordinary precision. Grandma's nose was a better spice measurement tool than any teaspoon because it was calibrated to the actual variables in that specific batch. The strength of that particular paprika, the freshness of that garlic, the moisture in that meat. Measurement assumes uniformity that ingredients never actually have. Number 12. Cooking rice by absorption method with a tight lid and no peeking. Rice cookers were not common in Black households of the 1960s, and the advice to constantly stir or check rice was widespread. Grandmothers who put their rice on, got the ratio right, clapped that lid down, turned the heat low, and absolutely refused to lift that lid were told they were being rigid and strange. But the absorption method with an unlifted lid is now confirmed as the superior technique for cooking long-grain rice. Every time you lift the lid, steam escapes. Steam is doing the cooking in the upper layers of the rice. Releasing it extends cooking time unevenly, creates sticky, overcooked bottom layers and undercooked top layers. Grandma's refusal to lift the lid was thermodynamic understanding applied through experience rather than equation. The result was always perfect rice. Number 11. Using chicken feet and backs in stock instead of just breast meat. In the 1960s, as prosperity messaging pushed the idea that chicken breasts were the respectable modern cut, using feet and backs for cooking was associated with poverty and was something families tried to move away from publicly. Grandmothers who kept using these cuts for their stocks and gravies were sometimes embarrassed by younger relatives trying to appear upwardly mobile. But chicken feet are extraordinarily high in collagen, which breaks down into gelatin during simmering and creates a stock with body, richness, and mouthfeel that breast meat could never produce. The backs contain marrow and connective tissue that add mineral content and depth. Modern professional kitchens now pay premium prices for chicken feet specifically because of their gelatin content. Grandma was making the superior product all along. Number 10. Letting yeast bread rise twice or even 3 times. Quick rise yeasts and one rise bread methods were heavily promoted in the 1960s as the modern, time-efficient way to bake bread. Grandmothers who let their dough rise punch it down, let it rise again, and sometimes punched it down one more time before shaping were thought to be unnecessarily complicated. But multiple rises develop flavor in ways that single rise methods cannot. Each rise allows yeast to produce more organic acids, alcohols, and carbon dioxide. The longer fermentation creates sourdough-adjacent complexity, a deeper, more nuanced bread flavor. The gluten network also strengthens and aligns more effectively with each fold and rise. Grandma's rolls on Sunday morning started on Saturday night because she understood through practice that time was an ingredient. Number 9. Using rendered chicken fat, what the community called drippings, as a cooking medium. Chicken fat, like lard, was under a cultural attack in the 1960s from vegetable oil marketing. Grandmothers who saved their chicken drippings in a jar on the stove and cooked greens, fried eggs, and sautéed vegetables in it were called old-fashioned. But chicken fat is high in monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, has a rich flavor profile, and a smoke point suitable for most stovetop cooking. It also carries fat-soluble flavor compounds from whatever the chicken was seasoned with, meaning it was a flavored cooking fat that added complexity to every dish it touched. No vegetable oil in the world does that. Grandma's drippings jar was a flavor bank that modern chefs would call a compound cooking fat. Number 8. Soaking catfish or fresh-caught fish in salted milk before frying. Southern black families in the 1960s had a profound tradition of freshwater fishing from rivers, ponds, and lakes as both a food source and a cultural practice. Grandmothers who soaked their catfish, perch, and bream in salted milk before frying were told by some health advisors that raw milk soaking was unnecessary and potentially risky. But salted milk does something remarkable to fresh-caught fish. The casein proteins in milk bind to the fishy-smelling trimethylamine compounds in the flesh and pull them out during the soak, dramatically reducing strong odor without reducing flavor. The salt simultaneously begins mild brining. The result is a cleaner-tasting, better-textured fried fish. Modern food scientists have confirmed the milk casein mechanism completely. Big Mama wasn't being superstitious about her fish soak. She was chemically purifying it. Number 7. Frying in a full pan of hot oil rather than a thin layer. Shallow frying in a thin layer of oil was promoted as the economical and healthier approach in 1960s cooking guidance. Grandmothers who filled their skillets with enough oil to come at least halfway up the food being fried were considered wasteful. But deep frying or generous shallow frying creates an instant crust seal when food hits the oil, provided the oil is at the right temperature. This seal prevents internal moisture from escaping and external oil from soaking in, resulting in crispy food that is actually less greasy than food fried in insufficient oil at insufficient temperature. Insufficient oil causes temperature drops and uneven cooking, which means longer contact time and more oil absorption. Grandma's generosity with oil was thermodynamic efficiency. The science of heat transfer in frying completely validates her method. Number 6. Storing open spices and dried herbs in a cool, dark cabinet, never above the stove. This seems simple, but in the 1960s, decorative spice racks above the stove were extremely fashionable, including in black homes where Jet magazine and Neighborhood Pride made kitchen aesthetics important. Grandmothers who kept their spices in a closed, dark cabinet were thought to be missing the decorative point. But heat, light, and moisture are the three primary destroyers of volatile aromatic compounds in spices and dried herbs. A spice rack above the stove experiences all three constantly: heat from cooking, steam from boiling pots, light from the kitchen. Grandma's spices in the dark cabinet retain their potency dramatically longer than the pretty rack above the stove. She was protecting the very compounds that made her food taste the way it did. Flavor preservation through environmental control. Number 5. Making sweet potato pie with fresh baked sweet potatoes instead of canned. As canned and processed foods became symbols of modernity and convenience in the 1960s and were aggressively marketed into Black communities, some grandmothers began receiving pressure from family members and community voices to use canned sweet potato for their pies to save time. Big Mama refused. She baked her sweet potatoes whole until they were caramelized inside, then scooped and mashed them herself. The difference is not just texture, it is chemistry. Baking a sweet potato whole causes Maillard reactions in the sugars inside the potato, creating complexity that canned sweet potato, which is pressure processed and lacks that caramelization, simply cannot replicate. The enzymes in fresh-baked sweet potato also partially convert starches to sugars during the baking process, making the flesh naturally sweeter and more flavorful. Grandma's extra hour was buying exponentially better chemistry. Number 4. Putting a piece of bread in the brown sugar to keep it soft. This was considered an old-fashioned hack that modern airtight containers had supposedly made obsolete. In the 1960s, plastic storage containers were being marketed as the superior solution to pantry storage problems. Grandmothers who tucked a slice of bread into their brown sugar jar were told they were doing it the slow, old way, but the bread releases moisture steadily into the surrounding sugar through evaporation, preventing the sugar crystals from forming rock-solid clumps. This is called humidity buffering, and it works through the same principle as terracotta brown sugar savers that are now sold as premium kitchen products. A slice of bread is a free humidity buffer. Grandma's pantry trick is now sold back to people at $12 a piece in a cute ceramic disc. The principle is identical. Number 3. Always cooking beans and legumes with a piece of kombu or a dried pepper. Black grandmothers in the 1960s who added a dried pepper or certain greens to their bean pots were thought to be following old superstition or just adding flavor carelessly. But dried peppers contain compounds that assist in breaking down the oligosaccharides in bean skins, the complex sugars responsible for digestive discomfort after eating beans. Reducing these compounds through enzymatic and chemical interaction during cooking makes beans significantly more digestible. Some grandmothers used what was available to them in their specific community and regional tradition. The result was the same: more digestible beans, better nutrient absorption, less digestive distress for the family. This was functional food preparation that addressed a real physiological issue in a community that ate beans as a primary protein source several times a week. Number 2. Never throwing away bacon grease, keeping it in a can on the stove and using it for everything. This practice was perhaps the most aggressively targeted by health messaging in the 1960s. As the war on saturated fat ramped up, the bacon grease can, a fixture in virtually every Black grandmother's kitchen across the South, became a symbol of everything modern nutrition said was wrong with traditional Black cooking. Community health outreach workers, doctors, and nutritionists told grandmothers to throw it away and use vegetable oil instead. But bacon grease kept at the right temperature in a covered can has a complex flavor profile from the curing process, contains fat-soluble compounds from the smoking process, and was used in small amounts to season vegetables, cornbread, and sauces in ways that transform the flavor of those dishes entirely. Emerging nutritional research has significantly revised the picture on animal fats and their role in a balanced diet. And the flavor impact of a tablespoon of good bacon grease in a pan of green beans is something no canola oil will ever replicate. Grandma's can on the stove was a flavor tool and a cultural touchstone for every Black Southern family that had one. Number 1. The whole body cooking method. Taste as you go, adjust constantly, and finish by feeling. This is the practice that was most systematically dismissed and most profoundly proven right. In the 1960s, standardized recipe culture, pushed hard through magazines, cooking schools, and home economics programs, all of which were largely inaccessible to or dismissive of black women, claimed that good cooking was about following instructions with precision. Black grandmothers cooked interactively. They tasted the greens, adjusted. They smelled the bread, trusted their instincts. They felt the dough. They listened to the sizzle. They were called imprecise, untrained, unable to teach what they knew. Modern culinary science, cognitive neuroscience, and sensory science now understand that interactive cooking, responsive adjustment based on real-time multi-sensory feedback, produces superior food outcomes compared to rigid recipe following. It accounts for natural variation in ingredients, equipment, and environmental conditions. It represents the highest form of culinary intelligence. Big Mama, Granny, Nana, Mama Dear. They were not uneducated cooks following old habits. They were expert practitioners of applied sensory science, feeding their communities with genius that the world is only now beginning to properly understand and respect. 25 techniques, all dismissed, all discouraged, all vindicated, and all passed down in whispers, in kitchens, in demonstration rather than documentation, by black grandmothers who trusted what generations of lived experience had proven true. The next time someone tells you that traditional cooking is outdated, remember every single one of these women. They were right, and the science finally caught up.